What happens when 24 experienced hunters track what they believe is their biggest prize, only to discover they've been hunting the wrong person entirely? Sarah Mitchell's story isn't just about survival. It's about how assumptions can blind us to the truth, and how sometimes the person everyone thinks is running away is actually running toward something far more important than anyone could imagine. For 3 days, they followed her trail through the dense Montana wilderness. Professional trackers, former military personnel, and seasoned hunters, all convinced they were closing in on a dangerous fugitive. They had dogs, helicopters, and state-of-the-art equipment. What they didn't have was the full story. When they finally cornered Sarah in that abandoned cabin, weapons drawn and adrenaline pumping, nobody expected her first words to be, "Thank God you found me. I've been trying to lead you here." The truth behind what really happened in those woods would challenge everything they thought they knew about guilt, innocence, and what it means to be a hero. The morning mist clung to the Montana mountainside like a shroud when Sheriff Tom Brennan received the call that would change everything. It was barely dawn on October 15th when his radio crackled to life with news that made his blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, 32 years old and a respected member of their small mountain community, had vanished from her home sometime during the night, leaving behind only scattered belongings and what appeared to be signs of a violent struggle. Tom had known Sarah since she was a teenager. She worked as a park ranger at Glacier National Park and had never caused trouble for anyone. Her small cabin sat nestled in the woods about 15 miles outside of town, a place she'd chosen for its isolation and peace. The idea that she might be in danger sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October cold. When Tom arrived at Sarah's cabin, the scene that greeted him was puzzling and disturbing. The front door hung wide open, creaking softly in the morning breeze. Inside, furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and there were clear signs that someone had left in a tremendous hurry. But what troubled Tom most was what wasn't there. Sarah's hiking boots were missing, along with her heavy winter jacket and backpack. Her truck sat untouched in the driveway, keys still hanging on the hook by the door. Deputy Maria Santos arrived shortly after Tom, followed by the state investigators who had been called in due to the apparent severity of the situation. As they processed the scene, a clearer picture began to emerge, though it was one that filled everyone with dread. There were traces of blood on the kitchen floor. Not large amounts, but enough to suggest violence had occurred. More concerning were the muddy boot prints that led from the cabin toward the dense forest beyond, prints that belonged to at least 3 different people. The investigation took an even more serious turn when they discovered Sarah's cell phone, smashed and discarded in the woods about a quarter mile from her home. The device was damaged beyond repair, but its location suggested that whoever had taken Sarah wanted to ensure she couldn't call for help. By noon, the decision was made to treat this as a potential kidnapping case, and the full resources of the county sheriff's department were mobilized. What the investigators didn't know was that Sarah had been expecting something like this to happen. For weeks, she had been living with a terrible secret, one that had been eating away at her and causing her to lose sleep and constantly look over her shoulder. 3 months earlier, while conducting a routine patrol in a remote section of the park, Sarah had stumbled upon something that changed her life forever. It had been a hot July afternoon when Sarah decided to investigate reports of illegal camping in the Whitefish Range. The area was supposed to be off-limits to overnight visitors, but park rangers had been finding evidence of regular human activity deeper in the wilderness than regulations allowed. Sarah expected to find maybe a few hikers who had gotten lost, or some teenagers looking for a place to party away from adult supervision. Instead, she discovered an elaborate operation that made her stomach turn. Hidden in a natural clearing surrounded by dense trees and almost impossible to spot from the air was a processing facility unlike anything she had ever seen. There were temporary structures, sophisticated equipment, and clear evidence of a major drug manufacturing operation. But what made Sarah's blood run cold wasn't just the drugs. It was the realization of how organized and professional this operation appeared to be, and how long it must have been running without detection. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She knew she was in tremendous danger, and that her first priority was to get out of the area safely and report what she had found to the proper authorities. But as she began to carefully retreat, she heard voices approaching. Male voices, speaking in low, urgent tones about schedules and shipments and the need to maintain security. Sarah realized that if these men discovered her, she might not survive the encounter. She managed to hide behind a large fallen tree and remain perfectly still while 3 men walked through the clearing, discussing details of their operation that confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't some small-time drug lab run by amateurs. This was a major criminal enterprise, one that was bringing significant quantities of dangerous drugs through the park and into communities across the region. The men spoke with the confidence of people who believed they were completely safe from discovery, people who had been operating successfully for some time. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the men moved on, and Sarah was able to make her escape. She hiked back to her ranger station as quickly as possible, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. But when she sat down to write her report and contact the appropriate law enforcement agencies, Sarah realized she faced a terrible dilemma. The men she had overheard discussing the operation had mentioned names and details that suggested they had inside information about law enforcement activities in the area. They spoke about patrol schedules and investigation timelines with a familiarity that suggested they had access to confidential information. Sarah began to suspect that someone within the local law enforcement community might be providing protection or information to the criminal organization. This realization paralyzed Sarah with indecision. If she reported what she had found through normal channels, and if there really was a corrupt law enforcement officer involved, she might be signing her own death warrant. But if she didn't report it, she would be allowing a dangerous criminal operation to continue operating in the park she was sworn to protect. Sarah spent weeks wrestling with this dilemma, trying to figure out the right course of action. She considered contacting federal authorities directly, but she worried that even they might have compromised individuals who could tip off the criminals. She thought about leaving the area entirely, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon her responsibility to the park and the communities that could be affected by the drug operation. During this time, Sarah began to notice things that increased her paranoia and confirmed her worst fears. There were occasions when she would return home to find small signs that someone had been in her cabin while she was away. Nothing was ever taken, but items would be slightly out of place in ways that suggested a careful search had been conducted. Her phone seemed to have strange static at times, making her suspect it might be tapped. And on more than one occasion, she noticed the same unfamiliar vehicles parked along the roads near her home or workplace. The stress of living with this knowledge and constant fear began to take its toll on Sarah's physical and mental health. She lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and found it difficult to concentrate on her regular duties as a park ranger. Her colleagues noticed the change but attributed it to personal problems or work stress. Sarah couldn't tell them the real reason for her distress without potentially putting them in danger as well. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to develop a plan. She realized that she needed to gather more concrete evidence of the criminal operation before she could safely report it to authorities. But she also knew that returning to the site alone would be extremely dangerous. She needed help, but she couldn't trust local law enforcement, and she wasn't sure how to safely contact federal authorities without alerting the wrong people. The solution Sarah came up with was both brilliant and terrifying. She decided that she would need to create a situation that would force a massive law enforcement response, one that would bring in outside agencies and make it impossible for any corrupt local officials to cover up or control the investigation. But to do this, she would need to make herself appear to be in danger, and she would need to lead the resulting search and rescue operation directly to the criminal's site. On the night of October 14th, Sarah put her plan into action. She carefully arranged her cabin to look like the scene of a struggle, using theatrical blood she had purchased from a Halloween store to create convincing evidence of violence. She scattered her belongings and overturned furniture to suggest a fight had taken place. Then she destroyed her own cell phone and left it in the woods where searchers would be sure to find it. Sarah knew that her disappearance would trigger a massive search operation involving multiple agencies. She planned to lead this search through a carefully planned route that would eventually bring the searchers to the hidden criminal operation she had discovered. But she also knew that this plan was incredibly dangerous. If the criminals discovered what she was doing before the authorities could protect her, she would likely be killed. And if her plan failed, she might be prosecuted for filing a false report and wasting law enforcement resources. As Sarah made her way into the wilderness that night, carrying only essential supplies and wearing her warmest clothing, she knew she was taking the biggest gamble of her life. She had no way of knowing if her plan would work or if she would survive long enough to see the criminal operation exposed. All she knew was that she couldn't continue living with the knowledge of what she had discovered without taking action to stop it. The trail that Sarah left was carefully planned to be easy enough for experienced trackers to follow, but difficult enough to suggest that she was being moved against her will by people who didn't want to be caught. She made sure to leave just enough evidence of her passage to keep the search teams on her trail, while also trying to avoid leaving so much evidence that the criminals might realize they were being led into a trap. By the time Sheriff Brennan and his team began their investigation the next morning, Sarah was already deep in the wilderness, beginning the most dangerous phase of her plan. She knew that the next few days would determine not only her own fate, but also the fate of the criminal operation that had been poisoning her community and countless others. She also knew that if her plan failed, she might never be seen alive again. By the second day of the search, what had started as a local missing person case had transformed into one of the largest manhunts in Montana's recent history. Word of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had spread quickly through law enforcement channels, and agencies from across the state were contributing resources to the search effort. Sheriff Brennan found himself coordinating with the FBI, the state police, Park Service investigators, and specialized search and rescue teams that had been flown in from as far away as Colorado. The search operation was based out of a temporary command center established in the parking lot of the local community center. Large white tents housed communication equipment, maps, and coordination staff, while helicopters came and went from a makeshift landing zone in the adjacent field. The scene had the organized chaos of a military operation, with dozens of personnel working around the clock to process information, coordinate search teams, and analyze the growing collection of evidence. Detective Ray Morrison had driven down from Billings to lead the investigation. A 20-year veteran with experience in kidnapping cases, Morrison brought a methodical approach that complemented Sheriff Brennan's local knowledge. Together, they had assembled a profile of what they believed had happened to Sarah and who might be responsible for her disappearance. The evidence suggested that at least 3 men had approached Sarah's cabin sometime during the night. The boot prints found around the property indicated different sizes and tread patterns, suggesting multiple attackers. The blood evidence, while minimal, was consistent with someone being struck or injured during a struggle. Most concerning was the trail that led from the cabin into the wilderness, a trail that suggested Sarah was being moved deeper into the mountains against her will. The search teams following Sarah's trail were led by some of the most experienced trackers in the region. Jake Winters, a former Army Ranger who now worked as a wilderness survival instructor, was particularly skilled at reading sign and interpreting the subtle clues left by people moving through the forest. According to Jake, whoever was moving Sarah through the wilderness was making some effort to conceal their trail, but they weren't being as careful as they could be. What puzzled Jake and the other trackers was the pattern of the trail they were following. The group appeared to be moving in a generally northeastern direction, heading deeper into some of the most remote and difficult terrain in the region. But their route seemed unnecessarily complicated, with frequent changes in direction and what appeared to be deliberate detours around easier paths. It was almost as if whoever was leading wanted to be followed, but wanted to make the pursuit as difficult and time-consuming as possible. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Jennifer Hayes suggested they were dealing with experienced criminals who had planned this abduction carefully. The fact that Sarah's truck had been left behind indicated that the perpetrators had their own transportation arranged, probably vehicles that could handle rough terrain. The destruction of her cell phone showed they understood the importance of preventing communication with authorities. Most significantly, the decision to move her into the wilderness rather than taking her to an urban location suggested that the kidnappers were familiar with the area and confident in their ability to evade capture in the mountains. Hayes found most concerning was the possibility that this abduction might be connected to Sarah's work as a park ranger. If Sarah had discovered something during her regular patrols that posed a threat to criminal activity in the area, her kidnapping might be an attempt to silence her permanently. This theory gained support when investigators learned that Sarah had been acting strangely in the weeks before her disappearance, appearing nervous and distracted in ways that her colleagues hadn't seen before. The search teams were making steady progress following the trail, but the terrain was becoming increasingly challenging. The group they were tracking had led them through dense forests, across rocky ridges, and into areas where helicopter support was limited due to the steep topography and unpredictable weather conditions. Each day took the searchers farther from civilization and deeper into wilderness areas where a person could disappear forever if they weren't found quickly. Marcus Webb, a local hunting guide who knew the area better than almost anyone, had joined the search effort as a volunteer. Marcus was deeply troubled by the route the kidnappers appeared to be taking. The trail was leading toward an area of the mountains that was notorious for its difficulty and danger, a region where even experienced hikers could easily become lost or injured. If Sarah's captors were taking her into that terrain, it suggested they might be planning to dispose of her in a location where she would never be found. The search effort was being hampered by increasingly bad weather. What had started as clear October days was giving way to the kind of early winter conditions that could turn a rescue mission into a survival situation for the searchers themselves. Temperatures were dropping below freezing at night, and there were reports of snow in the higher elevations where the trail was leading. Time was running out not just for Sarah but potentially for the searchers as well. As the teams pushed deeper into the wilderness, they began to find additional evidence that both encouraged and worried them. There were signs of recent camps, including the remains of small fires and areas where people had clearly slept on the ground. These sites confirmed that they were following the right trail, but they also showed that whoever had Sarah was moving her systematically deeper into the mountains with no apparent intention of releasing her. What the searchers didn't know was that Sarah was monitoring their progress and making careful adjustments to her route to ensure they stayed on her trail without getting too close too quickly. From her hiding spots during the day, she could sometimes hear the helicopters circling overhead and occasionally catch glimpses of the search teams working their way through the forest below. The sight of the massive search operation gave her hope that her plan was working, but it also reminded her of the enormous risks she was taking. Sarah had underestimated how physically demanding her plan would be. Living rough in the mountains while trying to stay ahead of professional trackers was exhausting work. She was rationing her food carefully, but she was already feeling the effects of hunger and exposure. Her feet were blistered from hiking in boots that weren't quite the right size for extended travel, and she had scratches and bruises from forcing her way through dense vegetation and over rocky terrain. More challenging than the physical demands was the psychological stress of her situation. Sarah was completely alone in the wilderness, with no way to communicate with the outside world, and no guarantee that her plan would succeed. If something went wrong, if she became injured or lost, she could die in these mountains without anyone ever knowing what she had been trying to accomplish. The isolation and uncertainty were taking a toll on her mental state that she hadn't anticipated. Despite these challenges, Sarah was determined to see her plan through to completion. She knew that the criminal operation she had discovered was continuing to operate while she led the search teams through the mountains. Every day that passed without the criminals being caught meant more drugs were being processed and distributed, potentially causing harm to countless people. Sarah felt the weight of this responsibility, and it drove her to continue despite her growing exhaustion and fear. On the third day of the search, the operation received additional resources that changed the dynamic significantly. A specialized tracking team from the FBI's elite hostage rescue team had been flown in from Virginia, bringing with them advanced equipment and techniques that local searchers couldn't match. This team included experts in wilderness tracking, behavioral analysis, and tactical operations who had experience in some of the most challenging rescue situations imaginable. The arrival of the federal team also brought new theories about who might be responsible for Sarah's disappearance. Agent Patricia Coleman, who led the FBI team, had reviewed intelligence reports about criminal activity in the region and identified several organizations that might have reason to target a park ranger. These included drug trafficking operations, illegal logging enterprises, and even domestic terrorism groups that targeted federal employees. Agent Coleman's team quickly confirmed that the trail being followed by local searchers was genuine and that Sarah was almost certainly being moved against her will by experienced criminals. But they also identified several aspects of the trail that didn't fit typical kidnapping patterns. The route was too deliberate and planned to be the work of panicked criminals trying to escape. Instead, it suggested that whoever had Sarah was following a predetermined plan that involved taking her to a specific location for reasons that weren't yet clear. The psychological pressure on the search teams was enormous. Every hour that passed reduced the likelihood that Sarah would be found alive, and everyone involved in the operation felt the weight of that responsibility. Sheriff Brennan had barely slept since the search began, and the stress was showing on his face and in his increasingly short temper. Detective Morrison was pushing his teams to move faster and cover more ground, even though he knew that moving too quickly could cause them to miss crucial evidence or walk into a trap. The volunteers who had joined the search effort were particularly affected by the emotional toll of the operation. Many of them knew Sarah personally and couldn't bear the thought that she might be suffering or in mortal danger somewhere in the wilderness ahead of them. The local community had rallied around the search effort in a way that demonstrated how much Sarah meant to people who knew her, but it also added to the pressure on law enforcement to bring her home safely. As the third day of searching came to an end, the teams had covered nearly 30 miles of difficult terrain and were beginning to approach areas of the mountains that few people had ever explored. The trail they were following remained clear, but it was leading them into increasingly dangerous and remote territory. Weather conditions were deteriorating, with reports of heavy snow in the high country and temperatures that could prove fatal to anyone caught without proper shelter. The command team faced a difficult decision about how much farther to push the search before conditions became too dangerous for the searchers themselves. If they continued to follow the trail, they would soon reach areas where helicopter evacuation would be impossible, and where a single injury or equipment failure could turn rescuers into victims. But if they turned back now, they might be abandoning Sarah to a fate worse than death at the hands of her captors. Agent Coleman made the decision to continue the search despite the risks, but with additional precautions and emergency protocols in place. The search teams would be equipped with emergency beacons and extra survival gear, and backup teams would be positioned at strategic points along the route to provide support if needed. Most importantly, the teams would operate under strict communication schedules to ensure that no one became lost or isolated in the wilderness. What none of the searchers realized was that they were about to enter the most dangerous phase of the operation, not because of weather or terrain, but because they were approaching the area where Sarah had originally discovered the criminal operation that had started this entire chain of events. The criminals who operated the hidden facility were aware of the massive search operation, and they were making their own preparations to protect their interests, preparations that could put both Sarah and her would-be rescuers in mortal danger. The fourth day of the search began with ominous signs that the operation was entering its most critical and dangerous phase. Weather reports indicated that a major storm system was moving into the area, bringing with it the potential for heavy snow, high winds, and temperatures that could drop well below zero. The search teams had perhaps 12 hours of viable searching time before conditions would become too dangerous to continue safely. Agent Coleman made the difficult decision to split the search force into two main groups. The primary team, consisting of the most experienced trackers and tactical personnel, would continue following Sarah's trail directly. A secondary team would attempt to circle around through more accessible terrain to establish observation posts on the high ridges overlooking the area where the trail seemed to be leading. This strategy would provide multiple approaches to the target area, while maintaining communication and mutual support between the groups. Jake Winters, leading the primary tracking team, had noticed subtle changes in the trail that troubled him deeply. While the sign remained clear and relatively easy to follow, there were indications that the group they were tracking had become more cautious and deliberate in their movements. Boot prints were being placed more carefully to avoid soft ground that would leave clear impressions. Rest stops were being chosen in locations that provided good visibility of the surrounding terrain, suggesting that the kidnappers were now actively watching for pursuit. More concerning was evidence that the group had acquired additional supplies somewhere along their route. Fresh food wrappers and water bottles found at recent campsites indicated that the kidnappers had either cached supplies in advance or were being resupplied by accomplices. This suggested a level of planning and organization that made the situation far more dangerous than a simple crime of opportunity. Marcus Webb, who was serving as a guide for one of the tactical teams, recognized the area they were entering as some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the region. The landscape ahead consisted of steep ridges, deep valleys, and dense forests that could conceal an army of people from aerial observation. More troubling was his knowledge that this area had been used historically by various groups seeking to avoid law enforcement attention, including bootleggers during Prohibition and more recently by militia groups conducting unauthorized training exercises. What Marcus didn't share with the search teams was his growing suspicion that they were being led into a potential ambush situation. The route being followed was taking them through natural bottlenecks and confined spaces where a small group of determined defenders could hold off a much larger force. If the kidnappers had chosen this terrain deliberately, they might be planning to make a stand rather than continue running. Sarah, meanwhile, was approaching the most dangerous part of her own plan. She was now only a few miles from the hidden criminal facility that she had discovered months earlier, and she knew that the area would be heavily guarded by people who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their operation. Her original plan had been to lead the search teams to a position where they could observe the facility from a safe distance and call in appropriate law enforcement resources. But the reality of her situation was proving more complicated than she had anticipated. The physical toll of 4 days in the wilderness was severe. Sarah was exhausted, hungry, and beginning to show signs of exposure and dehydration. Her carefully rationed supplies were running dangerously low, and she was starting to make the kinds of mistakes that could prove fatal in the wilderness. More than once, she had nearly lost her footing on steep terrain or walked into areas where she could have been easily spotted by anyone watching the surrounding countryside. The psychological pressure was equally challenging. Sarah was operating entirely on her own, with no way to communicate with the search teams or to know if they were still following her trail. She had seen helicopters periodically, which gave her hope that the search was continuing, but she couldn't be sure that the searchers were close enough to help her if something went wrong. The isolation and uncertainty were becoming overwhelming, and she was beginning to question whether her plan had any realistic chance of success. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. While scouting the area ahead of her planned route, she stumbled upon evidence that the criminal operation was not only still active, but had been significantly expanded since her original discovery. New structures had been built, additional equipment had been brought in, and there were clear signs that the facility was now processing much larger quantities of drugs than before. More alarming was evidence that the criminals were aware of the massive search operation and were taking steps to protect their interests. Sarah observed armed guards posted at strategic locations around the facility, sophisticated communication equipment that could monitor law enforcement radio frequencies, and preparations that suggested the criminals were ready to defend their operation with deadly force if necessary. This discovery forced Sarah to confront the terrifying possibility that her plan had actually made the situation worse rather than better. By drawing attention to the area through the search operation, she might have prompted the criminals to increase their security measures and prepare for a confrontation that could result in casualties among the searchers who were risking their lives to find her. The criminal organization operating the hidden facility was indeed aware of the search operation and was taking it very seriously. Led by a man known only as Victor, the group had been monitoring law enforcement communications and tracking the progress of the search teams with professional efficiency. Victor was a former military officer who had turned to crime after leaving the service, and he had built his organization using military-style tactics and discipline. Victor's immediate concern was not the search for Sarah Mitchell, whom he correctly suspected was not actually a kidnapping victim, but the potential threat to his operation if law enforcement agencies discovered the facility. The drug processing operation was worth millions of dollars annually and employed dozens of people in various capacities. Victor was not going to allow a single park ranger to destroy what he had spent years building. The solution Victor had developed was both ruthless and strategically sound. Rather than evacuating the facility and abandoning the investment it represented, he had decided to eliminate the threat by attacking the search teams directly. Victor's plan was to ambush the searchers in a way that would appear to be the work of Sarah's fictional kidnappers, thus maintaining the cover story while eliminating the law enforcement personnel who posed the greatest threat to his operation. Victor had positioned his most experienced fighters at strategic locations along the route he expected the search teams to follow. These men were equipped with military-grade weapons and communication equipment, and they had orders to engage the searchers in a way that would maximize casualties while minimizing their own risk. The plan was to hit the lead elements of the search force in a coordinated attack that would scatter the remaining personnel and end the search operation permanently. Agent Coleman and the other search leaders had no idea they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. Their focus remained on finding Sarah and apprehending her supposed kidnappers, and they were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a small group of criminals who were primarily concerned with escape rather than confrontation. The tactical preparations being made by the search teams were appropriate for a rescue operation, but they were inadequate for the kind of military-style ambush that Victor was planning. The weather situation was adding urgency to everyone's plans. The approaching storm system was now only hours away from reaching the search area, and conditions were already beginning to deteriorate. Wind speeds were increasing, Temperatures were dropping rapidly, and the first snow flurries were starting to appear in the higher elevations. Both the searchers and the criminals knew that time was running out for any kind of decisive action. Sarah could feel the tension in the air as she observed the criminal facility from her hiding place in the dense forest. The activity level had increased dramatically since her previous reconnaissance, with armed men moving purposefully between buildings and vehicles being positioned to block potential escape routes. She could hear radio chatter in the distance, though she couldn't make out the specific words, and she could see that sophisticated surveillance equipment had been deployed to monitor the surrounding area. The realization that she had led the search teams into a potential massacre filled Sarah with a combination of terror and determination. She knew that she had to find a way to warn the searchers about the danger they were approaching, but she also knew that revealing herself prematurely could result in her own death and the failure of her mission to expose the criminal operation. As Sarah wrestled with this dilemma, she became aware of movement in the forest around her. The sounds were subtle but unmistakable to someone with her wilderness experience. The crack of a branch underfoot, the rustle of leaves being disturbed by human passage, the faint sound of whispered conversations carried on the wind. She was not alone in the forest, and whoever else was out there was trying very hard not to be detected. Using every skill she had learned as a park ranger and outdoors enthusiast, Sarah began to carefully reposition herself to get a better view of the surrounding area. What she saw made her blood run cold. Armed men were moving through the forest in coordinated patterns that could only mean one thing: they were setting up an ambush. The search teams that were following her trail were walking directly into a trap that could result in their wholesale slaughter. Sarah realized that she had perhaps minutes to act before the searchers would be in the kill zone that the criminals had prepared for them. She had no way to communicate with the search teams directly, and any attempt to warn them would immediately reveal her location to the criminals who were now between her and the approaching searchers. But she also knew that if she did nothing, the people who had spent 4 days risking their lives to find her would be murdered in a carefully planned ambush. The decision Sarah made in that moment would define not only the outcome of the search operation, but also her own character, and the kind of person she was willing to be when faced with an impossible choice. She could remain hidden and hope that the search teams would somehow detect the ambush on their own, or she could expose herself to almost certain death in an attempt to save the lives of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice everything to help her. As the first sounds of the approaching search teams became audible through the forest, Sarah took a deep breath and began to move. Her plan was desperate and probably suicidal, but it was the only way she could think of to prevent a massacre. She was about to discover whether her months of planning and 4 days of suffering in the wilderness would result in triumph or tragedy. The sound that shattered the mountain silence was not the crack of gunfire that Victor had expected to signal the beginning of his ambush, but something far more unexpected and devastating to his carefully laid plans. Sarah Mitchell's voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the mountain valley, rang out through the forest with a clarity and urgency that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Federal agents, this is Sarah Mitchell," she shouted from her position high on a rocky outcropping where she had deliberately exposed herself to view. "You are approaching a major drug operation with armed guards. There are at least 12 hostile targets positioned for ambush. The facility is located in the clearing 200 yards northeast of my position. I repeat, you are walking into an ambush." The effect of Sarah's warning was immediate and dramatic. Jake Winters, leading the primary search team, instantly recognized the voice as belonging to the woman they had been tracking for 4 days. But more importantly, his combat experience told him that her warning was both genuine and urgent. Without hesitation, he signaled for his team to take cover and began coordinating with the other search units to assess the new threat. Agent Coleman, monitoring communications from the command helicopter circling overhead, was initially stunned by the unexpected turn of events. In 30 years of law enforcement experience, she had never encountered a situation where a supposed kidnapping victim suddenly revealed herself to warn about an unrelated criminal operation. But her training quickly took over, and she began coordinating resources to respond to what was clearly a major law enforcement situation. Victor's reaction to Sarah's warning was one of pure fury and desperation. His carefully planned ambush had been compromised, and he now found himself facing a coordinated law enforcement response, rather than the unprepared search teams he had expected to encounter. The element of surprise that had been crucial to his plan was gone. and he was now fighting a defensive battle against opponents who knew he was there. The criminals positioned throughout the forest found themselves in an impossible situation. Their original orders had been to wait for the search teams to enter the kill zone and then attack on Victor's signal. But with their positions now known to law enforcement, they were faced with the choice of surrendering, fighting their way out, or attempting to complete their original mission despite the changed circumstances. Sarah's decision to reveal herself had saved the lives of the search teams, but it had also placed her in mortal danger. Her position on the rocky outcropping made her visible not only to the law enforcement personnel she was trying to warn, but also to the criminals who now had every reason to kill her before she could provide any additional information about their operation. The first shots fired in what would later be called the Battle of Whitefish Ridge came from a criminal sniper, positioned about 300 yards from Sarah's location. The bullets struck the rock face around her with sparks and chips of stone, forcing her to dive for cover behind a large boulder. But the sniper's position was immediately identified by the search teams, who returned fire with precision that demonstrated their own military training and experience. Jake Winters had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a wilderness survival instructor, and his combat instincts were still sharp. He quickly identified the criminal positions that posed the greatest threat to his team and began coordinating suppressing fire that would allow his people to move to better positions. His primary concern was reaching Sarah's location and getting her to safety, but he also knew that the criminals had chosen their ground well and would not be easily dislodged. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in Montana's wilderness. Professional law enforcement personnel and military veterans engaged in a running firefight with organized criminals across terrain that made conventional tactics difficult and dangerous for both sides. The steep ridges, dense forests, and rocky outcroppings provided excellent cover but also made it nearly impossible to maneuver without exposing oneself to enemy fire. Agent Coleman's helicopter was forced to maintain a safe distance from the combat area due to the risk of ground fire, but she was able to coordinate with other aircraft to provide intelligence about criminal movements and positions. The thermal imaging equipment on the helicopters was particularly valuable in identifying targets hidden in the forest canopy, though the dense vegetation limited the effectiveness of this technology. Victor had positioned himself in the criminal facility's command bunker, from which he could monitor communications and coordinate his fighters' activities. But as reports came in from his forward positions, it became clear that the law enforcement response was far more professional and coordinated than he had anticipated. Rather than the scattered and panicked searchers he had expected to face, Victor found himself fighting experienced tactical personnel who were systematically dismantling his defensive positions. The realization that his operation was doomed forced Victor to make the most difficult decision of his criminal career. The drug processing facility represented years of work and millions of dollars in investment, but it was now clearly lost. His only remaining option was to destroy the evidence and escape with as many of his people as possible before law enforcement could consolidate their position and bring in additional resources. Sarah, pinned down behind her boulder by continuing sniper fire, watched in amazement as the massive law enforcement operation she had hoped to create began to unfold around her. Tactical teams were moving through the forest with professional precision. Helicopters were circling overhead, providing intelligence and coordination, and the criminal operation that had terrorized her for months was finally being exposed and attacked. But Sarah also realized that her own survival was far from assured. The criminals knew that she was the source of information that had led law enforcement to their facility, and they would undoubtedly try to kill her if given the opportunity. Her position on the rocky outcropping provided good visibility but limited options for escape, and she was effectively trapped between the ongoing firefight and the sheer cliff face that dropped away behind her position. The turning point in the battle came when Marcus Webb, using his intimate knowledge of the local terrain, was able to guide a flanking force through a narrow ravine that brought them behind the main criminal defensive positions. The surprise attack from an unexpected direction broke the criminals' coordinated resistance and forced them to retreat toward their facility in a fighting withdrawal that left several of their number dead or wounded. Jake Winters used the confusion created by the flanking attack to advance toward Sarah's position with a small team of experienced operators. The approach was extremely dangerous as they had to cross open ground while under fire from multiple positions. But Jake knew that Sarah's intelligence about the criminal operation made her a crucial asset, who had to be protected at all costs. The rescue of Sarah Mitchell from her exposed position on the rocky outcropping required all of Jake's military training and wilderness expertise. Using smoke grenades to obscure their movement and coordinated suppressing fire from other team members, Jake and two other operators were able to reach Sarah's location and provide her with body armor and tactical communication equipment. Sarah's first words to her rescuers were not expressions of relief or gratitude, but urgent intelligence about the criminal facility and the threats it continued to pose. She provided detailed information about the number of criminals still in the area, the layout of their facility, and the types of weapons and equipment they possessed. This intelligence proved crucial in planning the final assault on the drug processing operation. The battle for the criminal facility itself was the most intense phase of the entire confrontation. Victor and his remaining fighters had fortified the main buildings and were prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender. They possessed military-grade weapons and had constructed defensive positions that made a direct assault extremely costly for the law enforcement forces. Agent Coleman made the decision to call in additional federal resources, including a specialized tactical unit from the FBI and military explosive ordnance disposal experts, who could deal with any booby traps or improvised explosive devices the criminals might have prepared. But she also knew that time was running out, due to the approaching weather system which was now bringing heavy snow and winds that would soon make helicopter operations impossible. The final assault on the facility was conducted with overwhelming force and careful coordination to minimize casualties on both sides. Flashbang grenades and tear gas were used to disorient the defenders, while tactical teams approached from multiple directions to prevent any possibility of escape. The operation was textbook perfect in its execution, though the environmental conditions made every aspect more dangerous and difficult than it would have been under normal circumstances. Victor's capture came not through dramatic confrontation, but through tactical exhaustion. Surrounded by superior forces and with no possibility of escape or resupply, he and his remaining fighters eventually surrendered, rather than face certain death in a hopeless last stand. The relief felt by all the law enforcement personnel was enormous, as they had managed to resolve an extremely dangerous situation without losing any of their own people. The evidence seized from the criminal facility exceeded everyone's expectations. The operation was far larger and more sophisticated than even Sarah had realized, with connections to drug trafficking networks across multiple states and evidence of corruption involving several local officials. The intelligence gathered during the raid would lead to dozens of additional arrests and the dismantling of criminal networks that had operated successfully for years. Sarah's role in exposing the criminal operation made her both a hero and a target. While law enforcement agencies praised her courage and ingenuity in developing and executing her dangerous plan, she also faced criticism from some quarters for the methods she had used and the risks she had imposed on the search teams. The legal and ethical questions raised by her actions would be debated for months afterward. As the successful conclusion of the operation began to sink in, everyone involved started to realize the full scope of what had been accomplished. A major criminal organization had been destroyed, a significant drug trafficking operation had been shut down, and dozens of law enforcement personnel had demonstrated exceptional courage and professionalism under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the realization that it had all been made possible by one woman's determination to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Whitefish Ridge was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound amazement as the full scope of what had been accomplished began to sink in for everyone involved. As the last of the criminals were taken into custody and the evidence collection process began, the 24 hunters who had spent 4 days tracking what they believed was a kidnapped woman started to understand that they had actually been participants in one of the most elaborate and successful law enforcement operations in Montana's history. Sarah Mitchell, wrapped in an emergency blanket and receiving medical attention for exposure and minor injuries, found herself at the center of a media storm that would follow her for months. News organizations from across the country descended on the small Montana community, all wanting to interview the park ranger who had single-handedly exposed a major criminal organization by staging her own kidnapping and leading searchers on a 4-day journey through some of the most dangerous terrain in the region. The medical evaluation revealed that Sarah's 4 days in the wilderness had taken a more serious toll on her physical condition than she had initially realized. She was suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, and early stages of hypothermia. along with numerous cuts, bruises, and blisters from her journey through the mountains. But her doctors were amazed by her mental resilience and her ability to maintain focus and execute a complex plan under such challenging circumstances. Sheriff Tom Brennan struggled with conflicting emotions about Sarah's actions and their consequences. On one hand, he was tremendously proud of her courage and the results she had achieved in exposing the criminal operation that had been poisoning his community. On the other hand, he was deeply troubled by the risks she had taken and the fact that she had deceived him and his department for 4 days, causing them to expend enormous resources on what they believed was a genuine emergency. The debriefing process that followed the operation was exhaustive and sometimes contentious. Federal investigators needed to understand every aspect of Sarah's plan and its execution, both to learn from the successful elements and to identify ways that similar operations could be improved in the future. But they also needed to address the legal and ethical questions raised by Sarah's methods, particularly her decision to stage evidence of a crime and mislead law enforcement agencies. Agent Patricia Coleman, who had led the federal response to what everyone thought was a kidnapping, found herself in the unusual position of having to explain to her superiors how a missing person case had turned into the exposure of a major criminal enterprise. Her report would become required reading at the FBI Academy as an example of how assumptions and preconceptions could blind investigators to alternative explanations for the evidence they encountered. The evidence seized from the criminal facility painted a picture of an operation that was far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Victor's organization had been processing and distributing drugs worth tens of millions of dollars annually, using sophisticated equipment and techniques that rivaled anything law enforcement had encountered in urban areas. The financial records alone filled dozens of boxes and would require months of analysis to fully understand. More disturbing were the connections between the criminal organization and various legitimate businesses and government officials. The corruption investigation that followed the raid would eventually result in the arrest of 2 county commissioners, a state legislator, and several law enforcement officers who had been providing intelligence and protection to the drug operation in exchange for substantial payments. Detective Ray Morrison, who had coordinated much of the search effort, spent weeks analyzing the trail evidence and comparing it to what they now knew about Sarah's actual movements through the wilderness. Her ability to create a convincing false trail while simultaneously leading searchers to a predetermined destination demonstrated a level of woodscraft and strategic thinking that impressed even the most experienced trackers on his team. Jake Winters, the former Army Ranger who had led the primary tracking team, became one of Sarah's strongest defenders when critics questioned her methods and the risks she had imposed on the search teams. In his view, Sarah had demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and selflessness that defined true heroism, and her willingness to risk her own life to expose a criminal operation that was harming innocent people deserved recognition rather than criticism. The psychological evaluation that Sarah underwent as part of the debriefing process revealed the enormous stress and pressure she had been living with since discovering the criminal operation months earlier. Jennifer Hayes, the FBI behavioral analyst who had worked on the original kidnapping profile, was amazed by Sarah's ability to maintain her normal work and social routines while secretly planning and preparing for such an elaborate deception. The legal questions surrounding Sarah's actions proved to be more complex than anyone had initially anticipated. While her ultimate goal of exposing criminal activity was clearly in the public interest, her methods had involved filing false reports, destroying evidence, and misleading law enforcement agencies in ways that could technically be prosecuted as crimes themselves. The decision about whether to pursue charges against Sarah would ultimately be made at the federal level, taking into account both the methods she had used and the results she had achieved. The local community's response to Sarah's story was overwhelmingly positive, with many residents organizing rallies and fundraisers to support her and to express their gratitude for her actions in exposing the criminal operation that had been operating in their area. Local businesses displayed signs supporting Sarah, and a scholarship fund was established in her name to help young people pursue careers in law enforcement and park service. Victor and his associates faced federal charges that could result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The evidence seized during the raid was so extensive and damning that plea negotiations focused not on whether the defendants would be convicted, but on how much cooperation they might provide in exchange for reduced sentences. Several of Victor's subordinates did agree to cooperate with authorities, leading to additional arrests and the disruption of criminal networks in multiple states. The environmental damage caused by the drug processing operation was more extensive than initially realized, requiring a major cleanup effort that would cost millions of dollars and take years to complete. The criminals had been dumping toxic chemicals and waste products into streams and groundwater sources, causing contamination that posed serious health risks to wildlife and potentially to human communities downstream. Sarah's return to work as a park ranger was complicated by her newfound celebrity status and the ongoing legal proceedings related to both the criminal prosecutions and the investigation into her own actions. She found it difficult to perform her normal duties when every interaction with park visitors became an opportunity for photographs and interviews. The National Park Service eventually decided to transfer her to a different location where she could work more effectively without constant media attention. The search and rescue personnel who had participated in the 4-day operation were recognized with various awards and commendations for their professionalism and dedication under extremely challenging circumstances. Many of them spoke publicly about how the experience had changed their understanding of what could be accomplished when law enforcement agencies worked together effectively and when individuals were willing to take extraordinary risks to serve the public interest. The technological and tactical lessons learned during the operation led to changes in how search and rescue operations were organized and conducted throughout the region. The coordination between local, state, and federal agencies that had been achieved during the Sarah Mitchell case became a model for future operations, and the communication and intelligence sharing procedures developed during the crisis were adopted as standard practices. 1 year after the Battle of Whitefish Ridge, a memorial was erected at the site of the former criminal facility, honoring not only Sarah's courage, but also the professionalism and dedication of all the law enforcement personnel who had participated in the operation. The memorial included a plaque with the names of everyone who had been involved in the search and rescue effort, along with a quote from Sarah Mitchell that had become famous throughout the law enforcement community. The quote, taken from her first interview after the operation, read, "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks that other people think are crazy. But if you know something is wrong and you have the power to stop it, then you have the responsibility to act, regardless of the personal cost." The criminal organization that Victor had built was completely dismantled, and the drug trafficking networks it had served were severely disrupted throughout the region. Law enforcement agencies estimated that Sarah's actions had prevented millions of dollars worth of drugs from reaching communities across multiple states, potentially saving hundreds of lives and preventing immeasurable suffering among drug users and their families. Sarah Mitchell never returned to her cabin in the Montana wilderness. The memories of what had transpired there, combined with ongoing security concerns related to the criminal prosecutions, made it impossible for her to resume her former life in that location. But she continued to work as a park ranger in other locations, carrying with her the knowledge that she had proven it was possible for one person to make a difference, even when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The story of Sarah Mitchell and the 24 hunters who thought they were tracking a kidnapped woman became legendary throughout law enforcement and search and rescue communities. It was studied in training academies, discussed in professional conferences, and retold in countless articles and books as an example of how courage, intelligence, and determination could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. But perhaps the most important legacy of Sarah's actions was the reminder that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of achieving remarkable things. Her willingness to risk everything to expose criminal activity that was harming her community demonstrated that heroism is not the exclusive province of law enforcement professionals or military personnel, but can be found in anyone who is willing to put the welfare of others ahead of their own safety and comfort. The truth behind what the 24 hunters thought was a kidnapping had shocked everyone involved, but it had also inspired them and countless others to reconsider what it means to serve the public interest and to protect the communities we all share. Sarah Mitchell's story would continue to influence and motivate people for years to come, proving that sometimes the most effective way to fight crime is not with weapons or badges, but with intelligence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right.